I think that our keynote speaker this morning gets to the heart of this year's convention theme of many languages, one united voice. This morning, he will examine the loss of linguistic diversity as a result of globalization and take us on a virtual tour of language hotspots around the globe to hear from the last speakers of some of the world's most endangered languages, and he will explore strategies for language survival, including innovative uses of social media and technology. Our speaker is currently serving as a professor of linguistics at Swarthmore College and has completed extensive research on language extinction. He also co-founded and serves as director of research for the Living Tongues Institute for Endangered Languages, a nonprofit foundation that strives to advocate for the documentation, preservation, and revitalization of endangered languages. He has published numerous books on the subject and was highlighted in a documentary called The Linguists, which featured hands-on linguistic fieldwork from around the world. Please join me in giving a warm, actful welcome to Dr. David Harrison.
Thank you, Dr. McAlpin. Thank you, everyone. It is truly a pleasure to be among so many people who are devoted to language diversity. I have great appreciation for the work that you do, and I hope that in my remarks today you find even more reasons to continue promoting the languages that you love, and indeed all languages of the world. Since you're language teachers, I'd like to teach you a new word. If you could say with me, kaplaya. Now maybe turn to your neighbor and say kaplaya. This is a greeting in the Koro language of India, and just by saying the word kaplaya, we have tripled, if not quadrupled, the total number of people in the world who speak or hear this language. And to appreciate the beauty of the Koro language, I'd like to play a little video clip. This is a woman named Abamu Degio singing in her native Koro language. Now, Koro is one of just 7,000 languages in the world. People are often surprised when they hear that number. People are generally unaware of how much linguistic diversity exists. And most of these languages are not written down anywhere. They're not recorded in any medium. This comprises the greatest knowledge base ever assembled, and yet it is now quite vulnerable and threatened. We estimate that half of the world's languages may go extinct in this century. UNESCO estimates that we may be losing a language as often as every 2 weeks. And most languages have never been scientifically studied or documented, so we don't even know what they contain, not just in terms of the grammar, but the cultural concepts. The loss of even a single language to science, to humanity, and to the native communities is tragic. The loss of half of the world's languages, which is predicted in this century, is going to be catastrophic. So today I'd like to talk about linguistic diversity, where it exists in the world, why languages are going extinct, where languages are going extinct, why it matters, and what people are doing about it, both in terms of scientists like myself who are researching this issue and indigenous communities who are struggling to save their own languages. The world's languages are very unevenly distributed, not only geographically, but demographically. And I have a pyramid here on the left that represents the world's languages. The 83 biggest languages of the world represent about 80% of the world's population. In the middle, we have a group of about 3,000 languages. That's about 20% of the world's population. And in the base of the language pyramid, we have the majority of the world's languages, more than 3,500, which account for just 0.1% of the world's population. So the linguistic knowledge base is incredibly skewed. This slide shows a snapshot today of what is an accelerating trend, and it helps to explain why people who speak these languages or research these languages feel a sense of urgency. I've been traveling around the world for the last decade to meet many of the last speakers of the world's most endangered languages. This is a typical scene from some of my field work in Paraguay. I wonder if we could bring the image up on all three screens, please. We're interviewing a gentleman named Mr. Basso. This is my team. We have a couple of linguists, an anthropologist, a videographer. Mr. Basso is a member of the Chamacoco people. He lives in the deserts of northern Paraguay. He gave his age as 100 years old, and he personally recalls a time when his people lived as hunter-gatherers and foragers in the remote desert. They had no contact with outsiders, no knowledge of any technology. Now he lives in a village that has satellite TV, cell phones, computers, and foreign scientists flying in to interview him and put his interview up on the internet. You can just imagine the stories that this man can tell given what he has witnessed in his lifetime. It's truly a great privilege to sit down with elders like Mr. Basso and to hear some of the knowledge that they have to share. It's also a great responsibility because we then become the curators of this knowledge and want to treat it responsibly. Along the way, I have learned something about the forces that are interrupting the generational transmission of small languages and pushing them into extinction. But I've also learned something about that X factor, those intangible attitudes and beliefs, linguistic pride, whatever it is, that accounts for the incredible resilience of some small languages. How are some small languages able to defy the odds and to survive? Some people have compared language extinction to species extinction. They're not the same thing, of course. Languages are not biological organisms. They are socially distributed systems of knowledge. But there are some interesting connections between these parallel extinction processes, and I'd just like to point out a few. The first thing I would point out is that languages are much more endangered than species. At least 40% of the world's languages are endangered, and they're going extinct at a much faster rate. The second thing I'd like to point out is that we are in a similar state of scientific knowledge with respect to languages as we are to species. So if you read E.O. Wilson or you talk to a biologist, they will tell you that something like 80% of the biosphere, the plants and animals that are known to exist out there, have not yet been identified, taxonomized within a Western scientific paradigm. So for a biologist, the biosphere is basically out there waiting to be noticed. Linguists are in a similar state of knowledge. We do not have an adequate documentation of more than perhaps 15% of the world's languages, such that if they vanished tomorrow, we would know something about the phonology, the morphology, the syntax, and so forth. A third connection I would point out, when I said that the biosphere hadn't yet been noticed by scientists, that doesn't mean that people don't know about it. And so in these indigenous communities where I work, the people have a very deep knowledge of local flora and fauna. It turns out that most of what humans know about the natural world, plants and animals and species, is knowledge that is only contained in small languages that are themselves endangered. So the knowledge base about the environment is threatened precisely because small languages are threatened. So there's a very deep connection between language diversity and species diversity. I can't think of a better example of that than the Kalawaya people of the Altiplano in Bolivia. This young man, his name is Hilarion Zamos Condori. He's a young speaker in the community. The Kalawaya are expert healers. They have spent centuries walking the length and breadth of South America, collecting plants, experimenting on those plants, and learning to extract the medicinal properties. They have an ethnopharmacological knowledge base of over 1,200 plants and discovered the medicinal properties before they were known to pharmaceutical companies or outsiders. The Kalawaya language is not written down. It is spoken by fewer than 100 people, and it uniquely encodes this knowledge base that is of such obvious value to all of humanity. It's easy to multiply examples like that, whether you're looking Anywhere in the world, you could look at the UPIC, and there are 99 terms for sea ice, and I'll give you some other examples today of how languages uniquely encode knowledge. Bolivia, where Mr. Condori lives, is also designated a language hotspot. On this map, I've made Bolivia bigger than Europe because in terms of linguistic diversity, it's much bigger than Europe. Bolivia has 37 languages, but they belong to 18 distinct language families. By language family, I mean a unit like Germanic or Slavic. So Bolivia has a very high diversity index, 0.49. Europe, of course, has more languages, 164, but they also belong to 18 language families, so it has a relatively lower diversity index. And you may be aware of Basque, which is a European language that is an isolate. It has no known relatives. Bolivia has 3 Basques. It has 3 language isolates that are unrelated to anything else in the world, and unlike Basque, are very small and endangered. So by any measure, Bolivia should be prioritized if we're thinking about linguistic diversity and conservation. I've developed a model called Language Hotspots, of which Bolivia is one, and with support from National Geographic, my team and I have identified a total of 24 hotspots around the globe. We look for 3 things in a language hotspot. The first thing we look for is high level of language diversity, and I just explained what that means, so not just a lot of languages, but a lot of language families. The second thing we look for is high levels of language endangerment. So most of the languages in a hotspot will turn out to be endangered. And the third thing we look for is a low level of scientific documentation if the language has not previously been recorded. The hotspots model helps us focus and prioritize research. It also is a predictive model to help us figure out where we might find so-called hidden languages that have not previously been noticed by science. There are some surprises in the hotspots map. For example, Oklahoma, a relatively small state with just 3.6 million people, is a hotspot with 43 languages and 16 distinct language families. So today I'd like to take you on a tour of 4 of the language hotspots. We will begin in a rather cold place, Siberia. We will then go to Eastern Melanesia in Papua New Guinea. Apologies for that. Then we will go to the Pacific Northwest, to the state of Oregon, and we will end up in India, where we started with the Koro language. I'll begin with 2 languages of Siberia. I want to talk a little bit about Tuvan, where I started my own career as a field linguist in 1998, living with nomadic people for a year. And Tuvan really transformed and caused me to question my previous view of language. Now, living in the high mountains with the nomads, I was basically useless, and so the family assigned me the task of collecting yak manure, which seemed to be the only thing I was qualified to do. This turned out to be a blessing in disguise. I learned that they have different names for all of the stages of manure, which goes through a kind of metamorphosis. So when it plops out onto the ground, they call it miak. My task was then to come along, flip it over, mash it, come back a couple days later, stack it up on end, come back later, collect it, bring it back to the yurt, stack it up into piles, and they had a different name for every single stage. The final stage of manure, they call it argazin when it's completely dried, and it is magically transformed into something sanitary that you can bring into the yurt and use to burn and boil tea with. So I learned all of the stages of manure and began to realize the richness of the lexicon. Tuvans also have an amazing number of words to talk about ambient sounds in the environment, what we might call onomatopoeia or sound symbolic words, and they can make up new ones. So if you said in Tuvan, dingir, that might mean the sound of stirrups jangling as someone rides a horse. If you say dongur, that's going to mean the sound of a large, round object banging or clanging. And even though those are completely new words, another Tuvan speaker will immediately understand what kind of object you're talking about, what kind of sound you're talking about. So they have a very rich vocabulary for talking about ambient sounds. Tuvans also do something quite remarkable and astonishing with the human vocal tract that other people don't do. And I'd like to play for you a little clip of this young man, Marat, who's going to demonstrate for you the art of Tuvan throat singing. So that's Tuvan throat singing. I won't go into the acoustics of it right now, but that high ringing and buzzing sound that you heard is actually being produced by the vocal tract of a 12-year-old boy. Languages make us, notice things that we might not have noticed from our own cultural perspective. And so if you listen to Tuvan love songs, such as the one that Marat was singing, you might be puzzled by frequent references to the liver. And it turns out that Tuvans view the liver, not the heart, as the seat of human emotion. Well, we could laugh at that, but both of those metaphors are biologically wrong, but you're not going to send somebody a picture of your brain on Valentine's Day. So even though it's a metaphor, it's a very powerful metaphor, it just happens to be culturally contingent. Tuvans the Tuvan language made me notice other things that I had never thought of. For example, Tuvans have a word, E, pronounced just like the letter E, that means the short side of a hill. Now, you might not have noticed before that hills have a short side, but if you're carrying firewood or herding a flock of goats or riding a horse, the short side of a hill is a very salient concept, and you want to avoid it. Once you know that word, you begin to study the contours of hills, and you see the short side, you see the E in every hill. This is an example of how languages adapt to local environments, how they package information accordingly, and how they covertly transmit that information without explicit instruction in a very practical way as a kind of survival and adaptation mechanism. Learning to say go in Tuvan turned out to be quite difficult as well, more so than I had expected. It turns out that Tuvans have 5 words for go in their language, and in order to select the correct verb, you need to know, first of all, where is the nearby river. How many of you know where the nearest river is to us right here? Okay, it's the Schuylkill River, and it's right over there. And secondly, you need to know the direction of the current in the Schuylkill River. So anybody know the direction of the current? This way. So we need to know the river and the current, and then we need to know our own trajectory relative to the river current. And based on that set of information, plus the fact whether we're going on foot or by some means of locomotion, we select the correct verb for go. Now, nobody in the Tuvan community that I live in could explain this rule to me. They just laughed when I made mistakes. It's tacit knowledge. They know it without knowing that they know it, but they constantly have this river orientation system in their heads. And I found that Tuvans not only have a different sense of space, but they have a different sense of time. Tuvans view the past as being everything that's out in front of you, because you can see it. The future, by contrast, is behind you. It's behind your back. It's invisible. It's sneaking up on you. You can never see the future. It's impossible in Tuvan to say, I'm looking forward to next week. You're looking forward to last week. Next week is behind you. And so they have flipped the space-time metaphor. I spent a lot of my time, as I said, since I did not have nomadic life skills, collecting manure and also helping out a little bit with the goats. And I learned that Tuvans have a very complex system for classifying goats according to their colors and patterns. Mastering this system allows a herder to very efficiently pick out a particular goat from among the herd. It's also a way for them to manipulate the goat genome by interbreeding the phenotypes for desired traits. And they have a different system for horses, yaks, sheep, and cows. So this is just a very small clip from my field work where I'm attempting to learn the classification system for goats with my consultant Ned Mitt in Western Mongolia. So living among the Tuva nomads, I found language to have an entirely different texture, smell, and taste. I began to think of language as existing not only in the head, or perhaps not entirely in the head, but out in the local landscapes, objects, and lifeways. And if this expansive view of grammar is true, then you can't really explore a language by simply sitting down with a speaker in a room and asking questions, as people are often trained to do in linguistics. You have to be out in the landscape where the language is lived. So lessons that I learned from Tuvan include that language is simply more than we think. It's more expansive, it's deeper, it's more connected to the environment than we may think. It's not just grammar, it exists in rivers, it exists in the classification system for goats, for yak manure, in so many unexpected places that you might not look for it. And the human knowledge base is absolutely vast. People know so much about their local environments, and this knowledge is uniquely encoded in their languages. Remaining in Siberia, we're going to look at one other language, a very small language in central Siberia. The name of this language is Us. Us is a case study in language obsolescence. It has only 6 or 7 speakers. Us is the name for themselves as an ethnic group. It's also the name for their language, and it's also the name for the river that they live on. The Us people were traditionally hunter-gatherers and fishers. At the time of first contact with Europeans in the mid-18th century, they lived in birch bark teepees. They wore fur clothing. They made skis out of fur, and they had no domesticated animals other than dogs. They have a deep and intimate knowledge of their ecosystem, and they have survived some of the most difficult survival challenges on Earth in one of the remotest places on Earth. Their language shows traces of an ancient linguistic substrate that links them to languages spoken in Alaska. This is the environment where they live. People think of Siberia as snow and ice year-round, but in fact in the summer it's very warm, very green. You just have to contend with the mosquitoes. This is Anna and Alexei Baidashev. They are the last married couple who speak the Us language to each other at home. So their household is the last household on Earth where the language is spoken in a daily basis for conversation. You can visit the Language Hotspots website and see more information about them if you're interested. This is the location where the Us people live. It's absolutely in the middle of nowhere, as far from the ocean as you can get anywhere on Earth. Nobody lives north of them as far as the North Pole. You really have to intend to visit them. If you come to the film screening in a couple hours of the film The Linguists, you'll see a lot more about the visit that I made to this community. One of the things I did with my project, because Us is such a low-density language, I was able to actually visit every single speaker of the language. I took a GPS device with me, so I actually have a GPS fix on every single speaker, and I can plot the footprint of the language on Google Earth. And because the speakers lived at some distance from each other, we actually transported the elders from outlying locations to a central location so they could do something that we take entirely for granted, which is to have a conversation in their language. They were delighted with this opportunity, and they were very generous in allowing us to listen in and record some of these conversations. So this is a conversation between Vasya, Ivan, and Anna, 3 of the last 7 speakers of the Us language. I'm going to play it for you, and you'll see English subtitles on the left side of the screen.
Ai bestengah kaiter woto tunai bolgan kaiter
Eseng belum sih kaiter bisting
besteng dela ai tunduay,
tulkaya, kusukanaya, karkaya, kuokaya eta maya, manana kuokaya maya.
kuokaya.
No,
Pasol tundu.
amta kainar. Parcain pilikem, tiadam sa pes pilikan.
Mantos bilgiem.
Ay,
So Anna makes the gesture of forgetting. This is a picture of language obsolescence. They're trying to remember their 13-month lunar calendar. It was a survival mechanism for them. It was more precise than our solar calendar because it did not need to be reset every 4 years with a leap day. It actually stayed in sync with the seasons. And now they've forgotten it. They know that their parents knew it and they used to know it, but they don't know it anymore. Now, as a scientist, I can treat this little conversation as a piece of data. I can bring it back to my lab. I train my students. They can do phonetic transcription, morphosyntactic analysis. We can do an acoustic analysis. It is thrilling from a scientific point of view, but it's also a very instrumental view of the language, and one that is completely useless and uninteresting to the owners of the language, that is, the native speakers. So as a scientist, I also want to do something that is ethical and that supports the community's own goals. In the case of the Chu Lim, Vasya, the gentleman who is sitting on the left, had invented his own writing system for the language using Russian letters. He was a hunter. He used to spend weeks out in a little hunting cabin in the woods, and he devised a way to write the language, and he kept a hunting journal, which would have been the first and only book ever written in the language. One day he showed his book to a Russian, and the reaction was devastating for him. The friend scornfully said, "Who told you you could write your language? What do you think you're doing?" And the sense of shame that he had felt as a young person came back to him, shame about his language, his ethnicity, his heritage, and he became angry and he threw away the book. Working with Vasya and hoping that we could bring his writing system into wider use in the community, we took his writing system exactly as it was with no linguistic changes to it, and we produced the first storybook in the language. It's all hunting stories. That's the only kind of stories the Us people tell. And it was illustrated by local children. Now, I don't think that a storybook is going to save this language. Us is now a language in its twilight. The gentleman in the middle of the video has passed away. There are now 6 speakers left. And so we're very likely to see the extinction of Us in our lifetime. Lessons that I learned from Us is that language extinction is real. It's happening to real people in real places, and I've interviewed many of them. Secondly, that revitalization of a language is a strategic choice made by the owners of the language, and they may do this at any time. They may even introduce technology like writing in books at a very late stage in the life of a language, and that's their choice. We're going to move now from a very cold place, Siberia, to a very hot place, Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea is home to more linguistic diversity than any other place on Earth. It has more than 800 languages. And we don't even know why it has such immense diversity. It only has 7 million people. They live in small groups. They're in constant contact with other groups. People tend to be polyglots in that society. But rather than converging on a common language, they have stubbornly and steadfastly maintained immense linguistic diversity. We're going to be looking at a language called Panau. The word Panau simply means gimme, and the legend is that when the Panau people migrated to Papua New Guinea, they showed up hungry and asking for food and saying gimme. So this was an exonym, and they later adopted this as their own language name. Panau has the densest possible social network. All 600 speakers live in a single village, and this raises some really intriguing issues for me as a linguist. I wonder whether a language like this, with 0 degrees of separation between every speaker, might be very conservative, resistant to change. Maybe there's no dialect differences from one end of the village to the other. Maybe there's no disputes over saying pop versus soda. On the other hand, you could imagine a language like this changing very rapidly. A speaker of Panau, if he wanted to invent or introduce a new word, could literally walk out into the middle of the village, shout out the word, and broadcast it to every single speaker at once. Whereas in a big language like English, these kinds of changes take a long time to ripple through. I don't actually know what the answer is. Does a small language with a dense social network change slowly or change rapidly? And we need to study cases like this to figure it out. When my team and I came to Panau, we were immediately taken to meet Joe Mawab, this gentleman. He did not know his age, but he is the eldest and most fluent speaker of the language. And the entire community really enthusiastically got involved in our language documentation project. This is a scene in the men's house of the village where we had so many people helping us, people looking through the camera, listening through the headphones, looking at my transcription, making corrections to my transcription even though the language isn't written. Whenever we asked Joe Mawab how to say a word, we had 20 people shouting out the word, and the women who are not allowed in the men's house were standing just outside that window listening to everything and contributing their bit of linguistic knowledge. So I was so impressed by how the Panau community really embraced the idea of technology and of documentation, and I was also surprised they had a very unusual request. They told us that they would like to see their language on the internet. This was unusual because no one in this community has ever seen or used the internet. They had heard about the internet, however, and they knew that it was this powerful informational medium and that they wanted their small language somehow to be represented there, even though they didn't quite know what that meant. With support from National Geographic, we raised funding and we sent this young lady, Danielle Barth, a graduate student from the University of Oregon, to live in the community. She worked with elders like Kadagoy Rawad and began recording thousands of words and sentences in the language. We also recruited and brought Rudolf Rawad, who is the leading language activist, a political figure in the community, very impressive and charismatic man, to the United States to get training in language documentation. And I'd like to play for you a very brief clip of Rudolf Rawad talking about the current state of his Panau language.
Looks like there are about less than 500 people who speak Panau. And young people don't speak Panau. We speak Pidgin, which is a common language in Papua New Guinea. And so it's like children under the age of 10 would never speak a language at all.
Now, the scenario that Rudolf is describing is called language shift by linguists. It's a very well-known phenomena from immigrant families where in 2 or 3 generations the children will shift over to speaking the dominant language and may very well abandon the heritage language. In the case of Chinese or Polish or Greek, the consequences are not as dire. But in the case of Panau, if this language shift, which Rudolf has identified as now being aged 10 and under, comes to completion, the language will vanish. One of the things that Rudolf did when we brought him to the United States was sit down and work out a very simple orthography, and then he produced the first book in the language, which just so happened to be his autobiography, I Am Rudolf. He writes in I Am Rudolf how he writes about the daily activities in his village, why it's important to him, and how he was invited abroad to do linguistic work. He writes about how this was such a radical break with reality that the whole village came together and conducted a mock funeral for him before he left. Fortunately, he did come back to the village. He brought copies of the book. He also produced a number of digital stories, which are now up on the internet, so their dream of seeing the language on the internet has come true. These stories describe all kinds of fascinating daily activities in the village. And working with us, he began building the Panau Talking Dictionary, which is now online. Has, I think, 4,000 words in it currently, and it's constantly growing with contributions from the community. You can find many wonderful things in the Panau Dictionary. For example, if you look up the word canoe, you see all of these words for different parts of the canoe. You also see photographs of the community, how they use and build canoes, and you begin to appreciate the richness of the lexicon. There are many, many words in the Panau language for coconuts, picking and processing of coconuts. And there's a really interesting phenomena that I personally love called reduplication, which is known in many languages where you repeat part of a word. So you get a word like bak bak, or metalek alek, or sere sere. Now, languages use reduplication for many different grammatical purposes. In Panao, they seem to use it to denote a class of icky, wiggly things, like tadpoles, spiders, bats, geckos, and so forth. Now, this is, again, information that a native speaker couldn't tell you, but by putting all of this information into a database like a talking dictionary, we're able to search and find these hidden patterns within the language. This is quite thrilling for a linguist. On the community side, we bought a computer for the community. They got electricity in 2010. They built a special house to put the computer in. And in 2011, they got a very slow internet connection. So the first time they went on the internet, people in the Panao community were able to hear and see the voices of their elders speaking their language, which is what they had desired. So lessons I learned from Panao is that many small languages are poised, are eager to cross the digital divide. And that these communities view technology not as a threat, but as an opportunity. And having an internet presence can really help the vitality and prestige of a language and contribute to its longevity. We're going to move now to our third hotspot. We've been in Siberia, Papua New Guinea. We're now going to the Northwest Pacific, to the state of Oregon. And we're going to look at an extreme case of language endangerment, the Siletz language, which has a single fluent speaker. Oregon was and is part of a language hotspot. There were dozens of languages prior to colonial contact. Many of them have since gone extinct, and the remainder are hanging on by a thread. Siletz is spoken on the southwest coast of Oregon. The Siletz, like most of the native peoples of Oregon, were dispossessed, underwent forcible acculturation, genocide, pushed on to the least desirable land, and yet they've managed to hang on to their pride, their culture, and even a little bit of their language. If you look at the Siletz tribal website, they have a very ambitious cultural agenda. They hold feather dances and powwows every year that are open to the public. They have a Miss Siletz beauty pageant. And they also have a very distinctive agenda relating to their language. And I'd like to simply read from their website, where they say, quote, "Our language is as old as time itself. For countless generations, our people lived out their lives speaking our words. In all that time, our words were never written. They were carried in the hearts and minds of our ancestors. They were learned by each generation and in turn taught to the next." I love this statement because it emphasizes, first of all, the antiquity of the language. It is ancient and it belongs to that place. It emphasizes the orality of the language. It was never written. It was just memorized. And it emphasizes the importance of generational transmission, which is how languages survive. Working with Mr. Bud Lane, who's a member of the Tribal Council, Bud does not like to be referred to as last speaker. He is the only fluent speaker of the language. He hopes to create new speakers, which is why he doesn't like the label last speaker. Bud sat down and patiently recorded more than 10,000 words in the Siletz language. These have been put into a Siletz talking dictionary, which you can see here. For the first 5 years of its existence, the talking dictionary was password protected. At the request of the Siletz Tribal Council, they said, we only want enrolled tribal members to have the password and to listen to our words. Here you can hear one of the Siletz words.
Baby basket laces.
You
might not have known that baby basket laces was a concept, but it's a very important one to the Siletz. After the dictionary had been in existence for 5 years, they said, take away the password, we're ready to share this. And that has had all kinds of wonderful consequences. Many other Native American groups are looking to the Siletz as a model of how to digitize your language and use it for revitalization. And they are texting in the language. I spoke to a young man named Carson Viles, who's a member of the tribe. He said, I text in the language, and I said, oh, really? Who do you text? He said, well, I text anybody who'll text me back. And then he named me who those individuals were. It was his elder brother, his sister, Bud Lane, the speaker, and Jennifer Johnson, who's not a Siletz at all. She's a student of mine at Swarthmore College who'd been doing research on the language and had begun texting back and forth with Carson. I think there might have even been a romance going on there. What's amusing is that Siletz is the least likely language for text messaging. It has incredibly long words. It does not yet have LOLs and things that you need for texting. And Carson said to me, you know, there's a constant tension in our community between maintaining the cultural authenticity of the language and updating and modernizing it. And I view that tension between continuity and updating as a source of the vitality of the language. It's great that they're having these kinds of discussions. Do we borrow the word computer, or do we invent a new word in our own language that means brain in a box? So lessons that I learned from Siletz, an extreme case of a language with just one speaker, is that even in such a state, a language can undergo revitalization. And that linguistic ownership is real. Languages are, in fact, a kind of intellectual property, and the amount of ownership that a community feels over a language is in inverse proportion to the number of speakers. I don't need the permission of the French to learn French, right? Who would I even ask? But I do need the permission of the Siletz to learn Siletz and to use their language. It is their intellectual property. But since they're the owners of the language, they're not just going to hoard the language, but they have the prerogative of sharing it, which they have now done. And finally, that texting and other unexpected technologies like social media and Facebook can really elevate a small language and give it new domains of use. We're going to come now to the last hotspot that I would like us to visit, which is in eastern India. And we're coming back to Koro, the language that we all greeted each other at the beginning of the session. And I wonder if you could recall that greeting. Kaplaya. Kaplaya. Excellent. Good job. Koro has fewer than 1,000 speakers, and it's what I refer to as a hidden language. Now, Koro is spoken in an extreme northeastern part of India. What I mean by hidden language, of course, I would never use the term discover in relation to languages, because that represents an outsider's bias. But Koro was not previously recognized in the scientific literature, by the political structures of India, by the Linguistic Survey of India, or even by the local community as being a distinct language. We went to this part of northeastern India looking for two other languages that were poorly documented, Aka and Miji. And the Aka and Miji people share many cultural similarities. They live in bamboo houses, they cultivate rice and barley, they grow pigs and chickens, they weave their own textiles. This is Abamu Degya, the woman who sang to us at the beginning. Many of the villages are quite isolated. They're not connected by roads. You have to use bamboo rafts to get to them. But they are increasingly linked to the outside world, and many young people in the community are going outside to work. Sitting down with speakers and going door to door in the villages, we began documenting these two other languages that were known to exist. And at one point, people said to us, if you go to this particular village, you'll hear the other dialect. They referred to it as the other dialect of our language. Well, we sat down in that other village, and when we began going down our word list, we were astonished, because the so-called other dialect was as different as English is from Japanese. There was no phonological, morphological, or syntactic similarities. Yet this language was hidden and concealed within the larger community and simply referred to as a dialect. As we sat on the family's veranda, eating the locally grown oranges, we were told the life story of a young woman named Kachim, entirely in Koro. And this session is, as far as we know, the very first time that anyone had ever recorded this as a distinct language. So let's listen to Kachim.
Isigi omoro pisi emi pisi ginde terele lega aboy sam emi gi pisi to aboy de emi ya longar gol bachingara follow ralu nerego telo tore bega chare bega lorego tidere kalam.
Now Kachim is telling her own life story, which we pieced together with help. It's about her being sold as a child bride, moving to a new village. What's amusing is that when she pauses for a minute, her mother-in-law jumps in and just continues the story. This is a community where everybody knows everybody's story. The Koro language is undergoing language shift that's generationally graded. Young people under the age of 20 may understand it, but they rarely speak it. The young man on the left, Sunil Yamin, in fact, when we first met him, completely denied any knowledge of the language at all. His father is an expert speaker and storyteller, and it turned out, when we worked with Sunil more, that he had simply lacked the confidence to use the language. So this is another way in which the language is hidden. People that know it don't even necessarily admit that they know it. Koro is a very mysterious example. We know that it's a Tibeto-Burman language, but Tibeto-Burman is a vast language family with more than 400 languages. It doesn't seem to fit in. We don't know yet. We're doing comparative work to try to figure out where it fits into the family tree. Koro is also very rich in ethnobotanical knowledge. This young man, Anthony Deggio, took a walk with me one day down a jungle pathway, and in about 100 meters, he had already identified more than a dozen plants, named them, told me how they're used, how they provide medicines or use for the community. It's an amazing ethnobotanical knowledge base. Some of his knowledge, with his consent and the consent of the community, is now shared on my YouTube channel, where it has gotten hundreds and hundreds of hits. So Koro adds just one to the list of the world's 7,000 languages. It increases the known diversity just slightly, but its contribution is much greater than that fraction might suggest. It brings an entirely different perspective, history, mythology, technology, and grammar to what we knew before. So lessons that I learned from Koro is that there are still hidden languages out there that science has not yet noticed or paid attention to. Secondly, that young speakers are the empowered actors for language survival. Adults may think they're in control of the situation, but it's actually the 5- and 6-year-olds in a community who make the decision whether to keep or abandon a language. If that's true, that gives us the key to saving languages, which is simply to incentivize them for the very youngest speakers in the community. And we can think about some positive effects of globalization. Panau was never before heard outside of a remote seaside village in Papua New Guinea. Koro was never heard outside of a remote village in the Himalayas. Now, thanks to digital technologies, they have a global voice, a global audience, and people around the world can appreciate the wisdom and the beauty of these languages. I've met so many exceptional people in my travels who are language warriors, but two people stand out for their particular spirit and creativity in saving their languages. The first one is a man named Louis Kolisi, who I met in Papua New Guinea. He lives in the remote Karawari River Basin, where the only means of transportation are wooden dugout canoes. Louis sat down and talked with me and my team about what's happening to the language. It's spoken by 600 people in 2 villages. Children are pressured not to use the language when they go to school in a different village. They're made to feel ashamed of their heritage language, and this is a very effective way to cause a language to go into extinction. Now, Louis does much more than pose in body paint for tourists. He's also a political leader in the community and a very accomplished singer-songwriter. I think he's the Bob Dylan of the Yokoyam people. We sat down with Louis one day in his house, a rainy day, and he sang this song for us. I'd like to play you a little clip. This is Louis Kolisi of Papua New Guinea singing in the very small Yokoyam language. So this is a Yokoyam courtship song. Louis told us this is how he wooed his wife. And while the melody and the guitar might sound modern, the sentiment is uniquely Yokoyam. The lyrics go like this: your village, called Singalon, is swampy and full of death adders. I don't want to stay here. I'm going to go back to my own village. Come here, my dear, come to my home. Come to my river. My land doesn't have death adders. My place doesn't have death adders. So that's a Yokoyam courtship song, all about venomous snakes. That a language as small as Yokoyam could have such an inspired songwriter as Lewis might be one of the crucial, intangible forces keeping it in existence. And the importance of such language activists cannot be overstated. They share a deep conviction that their native tongue surpasses all others in its social intimacy and its power of expression, and they're taking actions to ensure its survival. Coming back to India for a minute, to the Koro community, I want to single out another young man. His name is Sangay Nimasau. This is a photograph taken by Chris Rainier, who's a very talented National Geographic photographer who often travels with me. Now, Chris likes to get people to dress up in traditional dress and pose. Sangay does actually own a silver crown and those yellow beads. He is the son of the wealthiest man in the village who has 7 wives and 38 children. But you would only see him dressed like this once or twice a year at the Rice Harvest Festival. So I told Chris, my photographer, okay, if you're going to make him dress up and pose, tomorrow when he comes to work with us on linguistic stuff, you've got to photograph him the way he is. So this is Sangay Nimasau as he appears in his daily garb. He is a thoroughly connected global citizen. He's a young entrepreneur. He owns a billiard parlor, a cell phone, a motorcycle. He sends text messages. But he's also doing something quite remarkable to ensure the survival of his language. And I'd like you to hear that directly from him. Here he is on the left, and his friend Kandu Degyo.
Asampa sampa lapani china for futanya fuminya futanya gijirin piarin hojara. Asanka sanka lapani china for futanya fuminya futanya gijirin piarin hojara. Ane na leboda jimeve. Ane na leboda jimeve. Ad du chen ba sana du chen ba patahla mujtro hanla.
So you'll recognize the genre. It's beautiful. That's hip hop. A little song about hot chili peppers and romance in an endangered language. And what's remarkable, these young men are both multilingual. They speak 5 languages fluently, including English. Their heritage language has no socioeconomic value outside of a few small remote mountain villages in the Himalayas. And yet, they've decided not only that they're going to keep their mother tongue, but they're going to do something virtuoso and creative with it. And what could be cooler than hip-hop, a genre of which the elders slightly disapprove, which makes it all the more cool for the youngest generation. I need to close with a question that I'm sure is redundant for this audience. All of you are engaged in promoting language diversity and language learning, and I'm so grateful for the work that you do, which creates a better society for all of us. I do often lecture to audiences around the US where people say, why don't we all just speak English? Can't everything be translated into English? Isn't English the universal language? So I want to pose this question. Languages differ in ways that are vast and incommensurate. I hope I've shown through my examples that you cannot simply translate the cultural wisdom, the insights, the metaphors, the plant names, the taxonomies, the technology that appears in so many languages. You cannot simply translate it into English without losing the human knowledge base. And we all have a role to play in raising awareness. I think one of the best answers that I've heard from young speakers about why language diversity matters comes from Mr. Anthony Degyo, the young man who knows so much about medicinal plants and who comes from the Koro community in India, this hidden language. Let's hear Anthony. He's going to be speaking English, and there are also subtitles.
It's me, Anthony Degyo. I'm an Indian speaker of Koro language. I would like to say some few points about the Koro language. Why our this Koro language is going on in extinct. Most of the families to send their childhood outside the village to study for further higher study. And when they come back to the village, they don't know how to speak the language, mother tongue. Where a young girl or a young man, a young boy could not speak a Koro language properly, and people used to mock at them. So it is a saying that loss of culture is loss of identity. That means if we lose our culture, then suddenly we are losing our identity. So we must continue our Koro language, continue our this traditional customs and languages, and follow the ancient our forefathers' teachings.
I'm very moved by Anthony's statement, and considering the fact that before he met me and my team, he had never even met a native speaker of English. And yet he's able to come out with this incredibly eloquent and powerful statement about how language is identity. If we lose our culture and language, we are losing our identity, and therefore we need to keep it. Language powerfully shapes both our worldview and our self-view. And I believe that people being coerced, no matter how subtly, into abandoning their language is nothing other than a form of violence. It represents an erasure of history, of creativity, of intellectual heritage. Keeping one's heritage language is every person's right. And happily, we can all contribute to sustaining this right and language diversity simply by effecting a shift in attitudes. And that is the work that you all are doing so wonderfully. By learning to appreciate and celebrate linguistic diversity, not only in places like Papua New Guinea, but right here in Pennsylvania, we ensure its survival. Around the globe, we are now beginning to see signs of a pushback against globalization in the form of language revitalization. And I believe this will be one of the most consequential social trends over the coming decades. And its outcome, nothing less than the survival of small languages, will have profound consequences for the intellectual capacity of our species and for the state of human knowledge. And for the work that you all are doing to promote languages, I will simply close by saying Kaplaya.
Thank you, Dr. Harrison, for that insightful and informative presentation. Please join Dr. Harrison immediately following this session at ACTFL Central in the exhibit hall, where he will be signing copies of his books. Following that, at 11 o'clock, he will offer a screening of his award-winning documentary, The Linguist, in room 114 this morning. Now I ask you to join me at the Welcome Coffee in the World Languages Expo in exhibit halls D and E. Have a wonderful convention.